English Forward presents.
Yeah, so where do I start? I started my career as a journalist.
Yeah,
I was one of the first employees at the Huffington Post and
that must
launched.
have been interesting, eh?
Sorry, say that again?
That must have been a really interesting time.
Yeah, I think what was it, about 2009. So blogging was just starting to sort of compete with mainstream media. And folks were trying to make sense of this platform that Huffington Post had just launched. And so, yeah, it was quite fascinating to be on that ride. And so was there up through our acquisition by AOL and was covering a lot of finance, tech, innovation issues, especially venture capital, which will kind of connect to what I'm doing today.
Yeah.
And so I was doing that for quite a while. Ended up covering a lot of technology startups and really becoming interested in the startup world, and felt like my best way of breaking into that world was having a bit of a technical grounding. So I went back to school for about a year to learn programming, specifically mobile development, and started launching some startups of my own. Learned how to sort of build a mobile app from the ground up and how to talk to engineers, and eventually joined a startup in Silicon Valley. It was a pretty high flying startup at the time, backed by Google Ventures, was a Y Combinator graduate, was there for a couple years, and we ended up getting acquired by Pinterest.
Hmm.
And then at that time, really started taking a long look at blockchain and cryptocurrency, and stumbled upon where I'm currently at, which is Bancor, and have been here for about 2 years, leading sort of our communications efforts and growth and marketing and partnerships and all that. And yeah, that is sort of my abbreviated version of my story.
It's quite a change going from sort of journalism through to programming and then getting into marketing, where you've worked with startups and Fortune 500s and actually helping them scale. You've got quite a unique perspective.
Yeah, I mean, at least in the blockchain and cryptocurrency space, a lot of folks say, it's as much of a sort of social and political innovation as it is a technological one. So the ability to communicate and motivate large groups of people is a very important one. I was very fortunate to sort of have this sort of background in writing and in finance and technology as a sort of analyst, and sort of, applying that to where we are today. And so, it's been quite helpful to kind of bring in this multidisciplinary approach. And working on growth and marketing in the blockchain and cryptocurrency industry is kind of uniquely positioned towards communicating and writing and all that. So it's been pretty helpful. And, to also be able to communicate to technical audiences and to speak to engineers, both internally and externally, with at least, some understanding of, the technical nuances has also been helpful. So, it's been an interesting path, kind of, I guess, the way that Steve Jobs said, you can't really connect the dots looking forward, but looking backwards, everything kind of
the beauty of hindsight. It's funny because I think what you say is spot on about communication, because you're sitting in the middle of people that are trying to build something, and on the other side, people that need something, and to try and get the message in a simple way across between the two different groups of people is a challenge. And I think what you're doing at Bancor is exceptional, because it certainly is like the piece in the puzzle that can connect those two and make it all work, which is great.
Yeah, it's quite interesting kind of going from at least the tech startup world where we were talking about reinventing, mobile analytics and how mobile apps can work better, to now this is actually talking about how we can reinvent the state or reinvent the, financial system. So these are sort of massive undertakings that a lot of folks that have entered this industry are eager to tackle, and the stakes and concepts are quite lofty compared to launching new services that make it easier for companies to do things, for people in wealthy cities to do things. This is like the kind of world that we're really trying to reinvent, and it's still early days. But it's pretty exciting to me to now think about changing the money system.
I think it's amazing. And Nate, your experience with mobile, because when we're talking about blockchain, and certainly from where I sit with the education field and looking at developing countries, they really are a mobile first developing economy and a system because of the access and the technology that's there and will be rolled out, obviously. Do you think that's played a big role in your sort of vision for what can be accomplished and the way you communicate that?
Yeah, a lot of the communities that we're working with to launch some of these community currency pilots skipped computers altogether, and a lot of them don't even use smartphones. They just use text. So we've had to not only build smartphone enabled services, but also USSD or SMS based services. And so the developing world is a really interesting place to pilot a lot of these programs that we think will rely on both USSD and smartphones. And it's this sort of lack of both technological and financial infrastructure that allows you to sort of introduce these systems and really have an impact. Folks that are in Kenya that are accustomed to sending text messages to their local vendors in order to pay for things, the psychological and technological leap to using blockchain is actually significantly smaller than folks that are used to using plastic and stuff like that. So in many ways, we think that the developing world could be among the first adopters of blockchain for commerce. Now, there's several kind of uses of blockchain we can think of based off of how we use money today. And commerce, I think, is further off in the sort of developed world. But in the developing world, I think for commerce, blockchain is much closer. In some of our community currency pilots, we're seeing thousands of transactions a day, and these are folks using the blockchain for basic needs like paying for water, food, housing, transportation through a text message, and they're using the blockchain without even realizing it. They're submitting transactions to a blockchain for these basic needs, which is just astonishing. So yeah, I think those they're definitely environments that could see a notable uptick in adoption way faster than sort of the developed world.
That's actually really interesting because I never thought about it in the context of SMS. I always assumed a smartphone type environment. But what you're saying is brilliant because number one, battery life on smartphones are so much longer, and that's one of the big issues that we've been talking about is access to power and sustainable power in communities that don't have infrastructure like we do in developed countries. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, we sort of came at it in the same way that you did, which was, we thought the smartphones would be enough, having a smartphone wallet. when we realized that a lot of folks don't have smartphones, we started, okay, so we will distribute smartphones to communities. It'll add to the sort of cost structure, but we'll check that out. And we realized that a lot of these communities don't have internet. So, and so we said, we want folks anywhere in the world to be able to access these services, regardless of whether they have internet. And so SMS and USSD was really the answer to getting adoption of these kind of community currency services. So it has been a kind of learning process, and we've really been aided by local partners on the ground who have implemented these community currency pilots before. Bancor is largely engineers building an infrastructure layer, and we rely on implementers and operators to actually deploy these technologies on the ground. And so discovering those learnings is kind of crucial to the growth of these networks.
Nate, if you've got any information or stuff you've written about and research that I could have a look at that you're happy to share, I'd love to delve into the whole SSD and SMS side of it, because it's something for me to think about, and it would certainly go a long way to fulfilling a need that's out there that we possibly aren't getting to at the moment, which would really help.
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. We've written quite a bit on this, and we've just started working with some sort of academic researchers and nonprofits that are doing really data-focused studies on that. So we're in the earliest stages of that. But I'd be happy to share all the literature that we have thus far. And I'm quite certain that we have in South Africa an operator working with our technology that I'd be happy to connect you with too, if it's of interest.
Yeah, thanks. Love to do that.
He might be in your vicinity, but I can start off by definitely sharing, what's been written thus far on these pilots.
Yeah, that'd be great. And then as I make some progress here, I'll certainly share, back what we find. A little bit about Bancor, Nate. I know it's the world's largest decentralized liquidity network, but how does it function, and what is the difference between a normal decentralized exchange?
Sure. So a decentralized, so the word exchange, or how exchanges function, is primarily based on matching both buyers and sellers of any asset. So it's based on this kind of classic bid-ask model. You might be accustomed, or think about, the 1980s version of someone taking a piece of paper with a buy order and connecting it with someone who has a sell order. And so there are all sorts of limitations that kind of bid-ask model has on sort of new niche and kind of what we like to call long-tail currencies. And that is if it requires that a sort of new or niche currency have a large number of buyers or sellers in order to be considered a liquid currency. And so if a currency is highly liquid, it's easier to buy and sell. The dollar is a good example. When we buy and sell the dollar through exchange of goods, it's not having an impact on the price just because there's so much liquidity in the market. But for sort of new and niche currencies, in their earliest days, because a lot of them rely on this bid-ask model, they're reliant on volume for their liquidity. And so the exchanges for the past 100 years have relied on this model. And while decentralized exchanges are extremely interesting in that they allow users to perform conversions without giving up custody of their currency, and it allows the sort of order book to be maintained by a number of nodes, we believe this reliance on order matching really fails this new generation of new currencies. And so what Bancor does is it is a liquidity network in the sense that it completely takes volume out of the equation, and that anyone can create a token or a currency that is intrinsically liquid And essentially, when conversions are occurring on the network, they're being processed by inventories of currencies that live on the network in smart contracts. So say I want to connect my currency to the network and create a currency. I'll essentially store an amount of my currency and an amount of the network token. In Bancor's case, it's the Bancor network token. I'll store that in a smart contract. And when someone wants to exchange a currency, buy or sell it, they're not being matched with a buyer or seller. They're trading directly against the smart contract. And so that smart contract is fully on chain, which means it's fully transparent. It's always available to buy or sell. You don't have to get matched with someone else. And again, it's the smart contract that's fulfilling the trade. It's not a order book or a sort of order matching system. And so this allows the sort of long tail of currencies to really thrive in a way that has never before been possible. All of a sudden, anyone can launch a currency that's intrinsically liquid without needing a large number of buyers or sellers in order to achieve liquidity. The liquidity is determined by the amount of currencies that are deposited in the smart contract that they connect to the network. And so take this back to the Kenya example I was talking about before. You know, a small village in rural Kenya that launches its currency, it can't achieve its liquidity through this old-fashioned bid or ask model. It can't achieve adoption through a sort of large centralized exchange. No exchange would list a currency with such a low trade volume. But by launching these types of currencies on the Bancor network and through the protocol, they can ensure the liquidity. They can ensure that someone can always buy or sell the currency. And we really feel that this is key to seeing this sort of long tail of cryptocurrencies emerge and currencies in general. And it's really going to shape a future where millions and millions of currencies exist, from your local neighborhood to your local charity to startups to digital creators to even, in your space, teachers or schools. And so everything we feel will have a token. There's all sorts of benefits to having this sort of currency diversity in the economy. And the infrastructure to do that, we feel, is finally here.
That's amazing. It certainly, makes so many projects viable that were completely not viable before,
Totally.
which is great. Just very practically, let's just say there was a school and they want to integrate a token on the Bancor network. What would be the process?
Yeah, so the technical process would to just create a ERC20 or an EOS-based token. There's all sorts of interfaces that have kind of launched to ease the process of doing that, and Bancor is rolling out some tools that allow it to be way easier to launch that token. They take an equal amount of those tokens and Bancor's network token BNT and deposit it in a smart contract that automatically connects you to the Bancor network. And that enables your currency to be instantly liquid and sort of algorithmically calculated to the sort of hundreds of currencies that are already in the Bancor network. And that includes very popular currencies like Ethereum or EOS or DAI. And so your currency can always be bought and sold for those currencies. And, I think a more interesting kind of question beyond the sort of technical components of launching it is, why would a school launch its own token?
That's a good question.
And I think the answer to that is it allows, I think we can start to think of schools similar to a lot of companies or a lot of, organizations that are being launched in the modern age as sort of networks. And the beauty of sort of blockchain and decentralization is it allows these networks to build new incentive structures. into their organizations. So, for instance, if you consider sort of the most common day networks that we know today, like let's say Facebook, that what blockchain will allow the Facebooks of the future, or maybe even Facebook, to do is to turn its sort of creators and users into stakeholders in the network, meaning that they can really become partners in the success of the network. So, what if, teachers and students, when they taught or took a course, would earn their credits in, or for teachers, their salaries in the school's custom token. And what if that token then could be used in sort of other schools? So I could take my credits as a student and utilize those credits that I earned to pay for a class in a different school. Or what if I could earn tokens from that school network by volunteering or launching some sort of organization within that school that benefits the school. So all of a sudden the school can compensate its sort of users and stakeholders in sort of a very new and interesting way. And it really offers the ability for the users to benefit from the growth of the network. So as more teachers and more students connect to the network and demand for that token rises, the holders of the token will also benefit from the sort of greater upside. In some cases, that could be a financial incentive. In other cases, the token could be, as I said, interoperable with other schools, or redeemable for other benefits within the school. So it really adds this sort of new incentive layer and new, network and network effect dynamics to schools.
That's incredible. So we're obviously talking about something a little way down the track here, because the sort of the gap is education. That's actually taking, like you've done with that community in Kenya, educating them and helping them understand how they can utilize the technology to actually improve their lives. So in education, how could English Forward actually assist in that? How could we go out and become a catalyst and educate people that Bancor is there to assist in liquidity and functionality, and actually create a better education system for millions of people that actually don't have access to those opportunities?
Yeah, I think we've been brought up thinking that the sort of single currency system is the answer. You live in one country, you have one currency, and the reason you have one currency is because it's just easier to exchange goods and services. If you have many different currencies floating around, it can kind of create confusion. But from our view, this sort of idea of the single currency system being the answer and efficiency being the answer is very much a lie. We really think that this obsession with efficiency has created this level of interconnectedness that is actually damaging the resilience of sort of local economies and local communities, and that we need to sort of take a shift back and away from efficiency and towards sort of sustainability and resilience. I want to take a sort of even bigger step back and use this sort of analogy that might make these concepts a little more grounded. And that is sort of, if you think about, let's say, natural ecosystems, and you apply those dynamics to our money systems, a extremely efficient natural ecosystem might be an ecosystem in which there's one type of animal and one source of food. And that type of ecosystem can grow very fast, and it's extremely interconnected, and it's extremely efficient because that animal is just always getting that same kind of food. But what happens if there's a sort of global shock, or there's a sort of, say, like a drought to the system, and that type of food is cut off? Then that ecosystem will die off because there's only one type of animal and one type of food. And so that ecosystem, while it is a very efficient one, it is not a resilient one. And when you have ecosystems that have many different diverse forms of life, that have diverse types of food, that is an ecosystem that is perhaps less efficient than the one I mentioned before. But when a global shock happens to one of the food sources, it is more resilient, and it can live longer, and it's considered more sustainable. And we feel these same mechanics apply to our money systems. And this is why we think there's such an important shift that is happening towards currency diversity and allowing new forms of money to be created and circulated and customized by local communities and local networks and institutions, and how that will help us achieve way more economic resilience. There's so much hyperinflation, cases we've seen over the past decades amongst different countries, and economic collapses, and really money not getting to certain pockets of society. And so we really feel this push towards currency diversity is an answer to that, and blockchain and decentralized technologies help us get there. And so practically speaking, it is really shifting folks' minds into thinking about these new forms of currencies, and sort of what is possible. And the biggest way to do that is to build sort of use cases for these different type of networks that have their own custom currency. And so the biggest help that I think a community like yours is actually stress testing and putting these type of technologies to work. So launching new type of currencies for community groups, for neighborhoods, for charities, nonprofits, for a community like English Forward, and sort of online educational sites. And even down to online educators who have YouTube or YouTube channels or podcasts. We even see those types of creators launching their own tokens, and their audiences benefiting from the growth of their audiences in communities. So it is really the sort of implementation of these technologies that we really are encouraging and empowering different groups to experiment with. And our goal is to really make it as seamless and user-friendly as these communities as possible. And so the more people using it, the more feedback we get, and we can get to a place where people have no idea that they're using a blockchain. That's really our goal, is to have the blockchain experience fade to the background, and have creating a token as easy as uploading a video to YouTube. So that's really where we're at. The stress stuff and all that.
Yeah, it sounds great. Two things thinking about living in Africa. When I look at Zimbabwe, they've probably got 6 different currencies as we speak, whether it's the US dollar, the Zimbabwe dollar, SMS, they barter, they survive because of hyperinflation, etc. So if you go to a community like that and you pitch another currency, so long as it can get them a result, they probably accept it, because they are used to change, not like Western societies that often have single currencies that they're reliant on, and their wealth and everything is actually inbuilt into that. But the question I wanted to ask you was, in a place like Kenya, for example, because you've got a working example there, from a political point of view, obviously there's stakeholders that could either encourage or discourage the adoption of a new technology like this and push it forward, depending on the reward that they get out of it. So how do you get buy-in from government, local government, sort of centralized institutions that might be negatively impacted if another currency was brought to the fore?
It's a really grassroots effort, and it's a bottom up effort as opposed to top down. Where our local partner there, Grassroots Economics, is going straight to the local chiefs of the communities, community councils, and so it's truly local, and they're not necessarily trying to have this occur from the top down, from the national governments. And to your point about there being existing alternative currency systems, I think those systems still fall short in terms of really benefiting the local neighborhoods and communities. I'll give you an example. In Kenya, specifically what we found in sort of studying these communities with Grassroots Economics, our local partner there, is what was happening is, especially in the rural communities, a lot of the money was coming from cities. Day laborers would, or seasonal laborers would go to the cities, perform their work, and then bring back, the Kenyan shillings or any of these alternative currencies from the cities, and then spend them on local services like haircuts or teachers or tomatoes, and then we'd see the money sort of circulate around the communities like that. But when the seasonal labor dried up, and all of a sudden that flow of currency was not occurring from the cities, the communities would really suffer. And it's a really crazy thought, because you still have naturally occurring goods and services in that community. You still have folks offering haircuts, growing tomatoes, teaching schools. So those still exist, but people just can't trade because there's not a local currency, a community currency circulating. It's still reliant on this sort of external flow from the sort of top down, whether that's, the cities or, big NGOs or nonprofits. So it's this wild concept that there are still sort of locally occurring goods and services, but simply because there's not, local funds to trade, these communities were really suffering because of their dependency on a national or alternative currency that was flowing from cities. So, we really feel that the answer is to enter it on a grassroots level, going through the kind of local communities, and it's a hands-on approach, but we feel one that's sort of will be more effective in the long run for building these sort of regional networks of community and local currencies.
I think you're 100% right, because the tribal system is certainly something that needs to be respected, because that's how the communities function. And you can get the buy-in of the chief or the elder in the area, then you're most of the way there to actually getting buy-in from the community, because they're reliant on that endorsement. It's interesting.
Yeah, and that's just the importance of having a really strong local partner there. Grassroots Economics, for instance, has been building these community currency systems across Kenya for over 10 years. They've been doing it with paper-based currencies. And having that sort of decade of experience relationships was super helpful in transitioning their system onto the blockchain and onto this sort of interconnected village level token system.
Yeah, really, really interesting. I am, when I was a lot younger, I got involved in a startup. It was before you could buy prepaid airtime via an SMS. Now you can go to the shop and you can order it at a till point and what have you, because a lot of our sort of recharge on cellular in South Africa and lots of parts of Africa is all prepaid, not on contract. And we developed a product where we would buy airtime from the network in batches, and then a banking protocol where people would put money into a bank account and then match the two and then send them the codes via the SMS, which they would physically write onto a piece of paper, like a little check from a network check, and they could present it to a buyer. And yeah, it was an amazing way of actually empowering people that couldn't actually go out to the cities and find employment and what have you, because they were bound, by locality to their region or whatever it was. So I love that idea of the community empowerment.
Yeah, and it's just so strange that despite, like I said, there's these tomatoes and schools and haircuts existing, that it's just these little pieces of paper, which is why people go hungry. Doesn't really seem to make sense.
No, it doesn't. Absolutely right.
And so, we feel this is, the community currency field is one that's been around for a few decades. And it's a really, it's a space of economics and local development that has never achieved true scale. And, despite having sort of, it seems so logical, right, that we would have these sort of forms of money on the local level that would, create these sort of closed loops of commerce and help communities really build capacity. But it never really took off. And one of the sort of forefathers of the community currency movement was named Bernard Lietaer. He just actually passed away a few months ago. And Bernard started his career actually as a central banker. He was at the Central Bank of Belgium, and was one of the chief architects of the sort of predecessor to the euro. And so it was really his ideas were sort of the creation of the euro, and he was sort of one of then moved on to the private sector and was really this sort of huge figurehead in economics and also as a currency trader, and then stumbled upon the sort of community currency world and spent several decades launching these community currency pilots. And each pilot he found, and we found the same thing, Bancor actually started its founders before Bancor were working on community currencies, community currency pilots. And it was the lack of interconnectivity of community currencies and this lack of liquidity, getting back to this sort of reliance on this bid-ask model and the exchange system that is preventing these sort of small-scale currencies from emerging. And it is this lack of liquidity that was preventing community currencies from really achieving wide-scale adoption. There was always this spike in usage in these systems, and then they would find that it just sort of plateaued and eventually stagnated, because folks were discovering that they could use these currencies within the communities that launched them, but then they couldn't use them outside at all. They were completely disconnected from the regional economies, from the global economies. So this incredible experimentation that's occurring now is what happens when we can actually connect community currencies to regional economies and say, create a network of 4 village level currencies, connect them all together such that a person in one community can use this community currency in the neighboring community, and eventually, in very small amounts, have it be liquid to even a fiat currency, is this the answer to community currencies actually becoming sustainable and scalable? So we really feel we're at the dawn of that era. And finally, these money systems are more viable. And they can operate without having to rely on sort of a central financial intermediary or a telecom. The monies are really managed on the local level by these community councils or chieftains or community elected officials who are, slowly but gradually getting sort of trained in these systems, and increasingly the sort of technological prowess you would need, that the barrier is going down as we figure out ways to sort of abstract the blockchain experience. So that's where we are, and to whatever extent you can put the word out to your community that we're constantly on the search for local implementers, whether they be neighborhoods or schools or charities or startups who want to experiment with this technology. We hope we can continue getting the word out and experimenting with this phenomenon on a global level.
Yeah, I think it's incredible. It's a really, really exciting time. If you anything that you've got that you can send through to me, Matt, just to read up a bit about it and
Sure.
a bit away, I'd love that.
Sure. Will do.
Have you got a couple more minutes for a couple of questions, or are you running?
Yeah. I've got probably about 10 minutes now.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's what I need. I know I know Bancor has been recognized by the United Nations and the Red Cross for its work on communities. And I mean, just chatting to you, I can see why and the vision for the future. On how important is that endorsement, going forward for financing and for implementation and for actual buy-in at a grassroots level from local communities?
Yeah, it's been hugely important. We were able to go to the United Nations on their first ever session on blockchain. It was called Blockchain for Sustainable Development last fall. And it was amazing being in there. I think it was called the Human Rights Room. And it was like, wow, that we have the United Nations recognizing the sort of impact of blockchain was just an amazing moment, and amazing to be there. We were there along with Binance, which has launched several initiatives in Africa as well. And to have all these global leaders, researchers, economists starting to take this space more seriously was a hugely empowering moment. There's a huge trend in the aid industry in particular of cash transfer. So, you hear the word UBI or universal basic income a lot, which is let's take this amount of money and let's not funnel it through nonprofits. Let's not funnel it through all this bureaucracy. Let's dump an amount of money on a community, and that is will be a mechanism to build some sort of economic development. And while, that strategy we feel is, admirable, we do believe that this sort of universal basic income and this sort of cash transfer is somewhat flawed. And what normally happens when you dump an amount of currency on a community is they'll just go out and spend it outside the community in sort of large cities and big businesses. And so the money just kind of leaks out of the community, and it doesn't build capacity on the sort of local level. So we believe, and this was the real message that we took to the United Nations, that we've been working with the Red Cross on, which is what happens if the cash transfer occurs in a community currency that is usable specifically within that community and within the surrounding communities. And what we've seen in the early results of our pilot in Kenya is it really does build local capacity, and really does, when that money is flowing to local and small businesses, it really does sort of create sort of resilience and sustainable local economic development, as opposed to creating sort of dependencies on this cash transfusion that is ultimately spent outside the community. And so, that was a big message that we took to the UN, and we think it was well received. And as a result, we're in touch with many different NGOs and nonprofits that are pioneering this push towards cash transfer in the aid industry, and tweaking it and iterating on it with cash transfer that's occurring in local and community currencies.
I think it's an excellent idea, because it just solves that problem, doesn't it, immediately? I mean, would you even think about taking it a step further and segmenting it? Because obviously there are guys in the community that are traders. There are people that are going about their business. There are people that are studying. There are youngsters that need to get access to finance to, get hold of educational material, etc. Have you given any thought to the allocation, or was it just the transfer to an individual or to a community bank, I suppose?
Yeah, I think it's sort of, really doesn't matter who the transfer is going to, as long as sort of there are some constraints on where the currency can be used. Those constraints, and sort of, again, going back to the, analogy I used with the natural ecosystems, and while having a currency that is liquid everywhere and can be used everywhere is a more efficient system, it often sacrifices resilience, right? And so having the transfer, whether it's going to the neighborhood, community bank, the local schools, so long as there are some built-in constraints into that currency, I really think that is the answer to building that sort of economic resilience, as opposed to sort of the kind of dependencies that we've seen in a lot of UBI and cash transfer programs.
Yeah, and with the program that you're doing in Kenya with Grassroots, do you have sort of documentation on the case study? And
Yeah.
So what I'm particularly interested in is the education side of it. So how intuitive is it for a person on the ground to utilize the technology without even knowing their blockchain, as you mentioned, and get a benefit out of it? So without having to really teach them a lot, is relying on intuition and things that we all know to actually access new ways of, getting goods and services.
Yeah, I would say schools are just actually in the last quarter were a very fast growing sector for us. We get breakdowns of the spending in these pilots, and I know that schools were really fast growing in one of the highest spending categories in the pilot. So I'd be happy to share the sort of case studies on that and the data there. And yeah, a lot of these schools, they're not super advanced in payments and any of that. This is all happening through text messages, right? When a child, is enrolled, the tuitions are paid via text, and it's totally unknown to the teachers or the students that they're actually using a blockchain. They're using the Ethereum blockchain through a side chain called POA. So there's this incredibly complex stack, that is powering the whole system, but it's abstracted away because obviously we can't have local teachers, submitting blockchain transactions.
No.
It's just too complex. So yeah, it is. It's schooling and education is a big sector in these pilots, and I'm excited to share some of the case studies with you on that.
Yeah, thanks. And then Nate, just from my side, we've obviously got our question and answer and community side on English Forward that is free for people to use. and proportionately with a global population that actually needs it. We've hardly scratched the surface. So if there's anybody on the ground at grassroots, whoever that I could communicate to and actually show them how to use it, implement it in their schools, I mean, it's there. It's a beautiful resource that they can use, and I'd be very happy to share that.
Sure. I'll be happy to connect you with one of the co-founders of Grassroots. His name's Will Ruddick. Okay. And he's a great guy, and I'm sure he'll be receptive to learning more about it.
Yeah, that sounds great. But gee, thanks, man. I really appreciate your time. It's been fascinating chatting to you.
Yeah, of course. So what will the outcome of this interview be? You said it will.
It's going to be published in various mediums. One of them, Cryptopolitan.
Okay.
On the actual blog and then on the YouTube side as well. And then we're going to use it in a lot of our medium too. So as soon as it's actually been sorted out, I'll get the info from Key when it's all been, all the sort of work's been complete. And then I'll just send you the links and let you know where it's going to go.
Oh, cool. And it's going to be, you said, an audio
It'll be audio. And it'll also be transcribed, so you'll have both.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Mitch, so much for the opportunity. And I'll follow up with some reading, and I'll also connect you with Will Ruddick, the head of Grassroots, so you guys can take the conversation from there.
Yeah, thanks. And then, Nate, if I have got any questions, do you mind if I just pop them through in an email and ask you when you've got some time, just zip? And it's more around the research and how I can actually get involved and we can help.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Happy to answer any questions. No question too small.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Mitch. Have a great day. Thanks again.
Cheers.
Take care. Bye.
You were listening to an English Forward production, the web's largest Learn English community and Q&A site. Everything you need to understand and improve your English. Visit EnglishForward.com.